No, I'm okay. Thank you. So yesterday we were looking into this article and we established that if an employee's resignation causes a davar ha'aved, causes a financial loss or some other kind of loss, there is limited liability on an employee unless he was bonded with some kind of contract beforehand. But his limited liability only extends, according to the Gemara, to the amount that he would have been compensated had he completed the job, even though the potential for damage is much far exceeds that, right? So, so that was the question. Let's say, for example, a musician quits and doesn't show up at the wedding. The potential for damages is much higher than what he would have been paid. Or the photographer doesn't show up and doesn't take the photos, or he takes what happened in my parents' wedding is that the photographer took the photos, but he had bad film. So they didn't get their photos.
About one that they forgot to turn on the camera.
Or the lens cap was on, yeah. Yeah.
Others. The guy just didn't turn on.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's more than, so you could say, well, I'm not going to pay you, but the damage far exceeds that, right? So, and then we said, al yesoda revut. This is what we were up to. Midivrei haramban v'haritk v'kvi shehuvu b'mamar hakodem ola ki yesh element chozi b'chiyuv zeh hanilmad midin arevut. There seems to be some aspect of communal responsibility. The chol sheivtiach lachavero v'samach chavero alav, that if a person made some type of guarantee or some type of assurance to his fellow Jew, and his friend relied on him, and if it were not for that reliance, he would not have incurred a loss. Chayev l'shalem im pasha b'davar. So you have to pay if the person who made that assurance ends up being negligent. That's the language of the Ritva. Kolomar, that is to say, yesh kan hitchayvut michlala l'shalem d'mei hefsed sheyigram hapol b'chazarato. There's some kind of obligation that a person who makes an assurance to another person has when he withdraws or when he quits. And therefore he can be assessed to pay up until his wages. And so he says you have to assume that that's what was assumed. It was assumed that I would take liability or responsibility up until what I was willing to get paid. So there's a limited liability. That's the assumption. And then we have this idea of takanat chachamim. Bal netivot hamishpat shenizkar la'el amar al koshi shebehesber shel garmi u'masber ki davar aved banu al takanat chachamim. He says that it's based on just a stam takanas chachamim, that the rabbis wanted to make a person who was relying on a laborer to make him whole. Gam lefizeh barur ki ein lishal al gbalat achiyuv shekach kein tiknu. And shekain kach tiknu, he says, and therefore you can't really challenge why is it a limited liability and not a full liability, because that's what they instituted. Lefi has berim elu kam achiyuv shel ha'ovid lelo ma'aseh kinyan v'af lifnei techilat hamelacha. And therefore, the obligation of a laborer, even without a handshake, even without a kinyan, even without having started the work, there is some kind of liability. V'yachein kach meforish b'rayvid va'od. Mishum kachiv zeomer gam biyachas lepol shelagabav ein kinyan tofes kebekablan ki achiv ka'omer lo talui b'kinyan. And like we said before, anytime you hire someone, you don't need a kinyan in order for that employee-employer relationship to be legally binding. That's the one kind of relationship which doesn't require a formal contract. The very fact that I've hired you, even verbally, creates a binding contract. Amna. And then he says, but with all of that said, the makbil l'mashal amadnu biyachas lechazarat ha'ma'avid, ki chiyuvo kemazik mutne bekach shebe'et arichat ha'chozeh yachal ha'ovid lahasig ma'avid chalifi. He says in our previous essay, where we talked about the employer's duties to his employee, if the employer cancels the job at the last minute or fires him in the middle of the job, and there the employee has rights of compensation because he could always argue, I could have gotten another job somewhere else. Omer harashba ki gam chiyuvo shel ha'oved b'davar ha'oved mutna bekach ki bishat arichat eskem yachol ha'ma'avid lahasig oved chalifi. The Rashba says it also, another criterion will be, could the employer have gotten another worker had he not relied on this one? Shekain rak b'mikra zeh garam ha'oved nezek b'chazarato. So in that situation, it's clear and obvious that the employee has caused real damage to the employer by not showing up or by quitting. Ach im ba'oto zman lahaya oved acher to'ein ka'et to'ein ka'et ha'oved klape ha'ma'avid ki ben kach lahaya nifsad v'lo hu b'chazarato garam lahefsedo. However, if there was no one else to employ, in other words, there was no one else able to do this job at the time when I hired him, so then he hasn't really caused me tangible damage. Because if I would have turned down the job, if the guy would have turned down the job and not taken the job, he wouldn't have been able to find anyone else to do it. So therefore, I have the guy hasn't caused him any out-of-pocket damage. Tonight's
Can we fashion a case like that? I'm trying to imagine a situation where someone is so unique that you couldn't find someone else who could do that job.
Sure. I think there's
Like, you know,
I hire someone to paint a portrait, and then there's only one artist that I want. I don't want anyone else to paint my portrait. So that could be an example.
This is a lot where there's people with a certain skill that they're not around anymore. You know, it's just, you can't find people like who do these types of. Somebody who fixes fax machines. Try to find a guy. You know, doctors still use fax machines.
right,
How many guys are there out there who knows how to fix a fax? Or we even know what a fax machine is.
right. Yeah, exactly. Or
Uh,
like I'm thinking even with the artist. So, okay, so you get someone else who's not,
Yeah, no, but I don't want anyone else. I only want this guy to paint my
because I was thinking about hiring a speaker for the shul or something like that, but I mean, you could just
right.
substitute with somebody else. It's not the same
Yeah,
person.
no, I'm saying let's say there's a person who's a patron of a certain rabbi, and he wants to bring him out for Shabbos,
Right,
and the guy cancels on him at the last minute.
yeah, he doesn't
So-
want anyone else.
He specifically wanted that one person.
Okay, all right,
Okay.
okay, thank you.
Tanai ze amor lo rak lehesber shel garmi, ela gam lehesber ki davar ha'aved hu chiyuv miyuchad banui al arevut, shekin gam lehesber ze achiyuv banui al hefsido shel hamavid shenigra mikach shesamach al haftachat ha'oved. He's writing in legalese in a very lengthy way. Klomar shahita lo opatzia acheret sheviter aleha ekev haftachato shel zeh. So it's the same thing that we said when we talked about an employer versus an employee, where the employee who gets quit, who gets dumped at the last minute, says, I had an opportunity to get another job, and I put everything aside for you, right? But if the employee couldn't have gotten the job anywhere else, so there really isn't any out-of-pocket loss. And the same thing applies to an employer. Amnam tenai zeh eino mofia b'chol harishonim v'lo mitzativ b'Ramban shelefanenu. He says not everyone, however, acknowledges this, that it'll depend upon whether other work was available or other workers were available. Adarabba habes Yosef b'shem haRamban eino matzrich tenai zeh b'nimuko imo. However, the Beis Yosef does not require that condition, that he could have found someone else to do the job. La'olam lo yachol hama'avid liton ki hayamotze oved hacher, afim hataynu zu lo titkabel b'mikre hafuch mitzad ha'oved. He says the employer can't claim that he could have found another person to do the job, even if vice versa, we do say that the employee has rights because he could have found other work. Efshar lahasbir et hahevdel bazeh shekal limtso oved me'asher limtso ma'avid. One might argue that there's a difference. It's easier to find a worker than it is to find a job. It's easier to find a worker than it is to find a job. There are more workers available than there are jobs available. But I don't know, that's very subjective. It all depends on the job market, right?
But also the person's skills.
It all depends on the person's skills.
Yeah.
Exactly. Adam la'amal yulad kipshuto uba ba'avoda tluya parnasaso. Uvdihi ki b'derech klal rabim ha'ovdim min ha'avida. The general rule, he says, is that there are more employees than employers. Hasocher es hapoyelim b'loshon chazal ma'avid echad lekama avodim. So lekama ovdim. It seems like in the times of Chazal, the employer had the advantage because there were more employees than there were jobs. But that could translate into why the halacha was structured in such a way that the employer has less rights because he always has the advantage of it being able to find other workers.
Isn't that something that's wrong because to protect the employee?
Well, no. So that's the point, is that we do protect the employee, but in a more, let's say, we protect the employee more than we protect the employer. That's the argument that he's making, because the employer always has the advantage, since there are more workers available than there are employers. So we give the advantage to the employee because he's more likely to be exploited. That's his argument. So basically, he says it's a machlokes. Some say that there's complete equality and reciprocity between the employer's rights and the employee's rights. So just like an employee who could argue that I could have gotten a job somewhere else has rights to compensation when he set aside that time, so an employer has rights of compensation because he could have gotten someone else. On the other hand, there are those who say that that's not always the case, that sometimes an employer has to swallow the loss because we don't award him as many rights as we award to the employee.
Rabbi, in Rabbi Schrader's comments, he was saying that depending on the skills of the employee,
right, that to the teacher he was talking about.
or the laborer, where basically if the laborer left or got fired halfway through the job, there was a pool of laborers that they could go and get another laborer from. So there was no loss to anybody in that respect. This doesn't seem to say that.
Correct. This says it's more complicated.
Right.
And it's a little bit more satisfying, this tshuva, because he goes through all of the different permutations. It depends. Was there someone else to do this job or not? And was there other work to be had or not? Okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit more because he's getting into the weeds. Okay, so we had said that what is the legal recourse that an employer has when a guy quits on him in the middle of the job? So the Mishnah had said socher alehen o mata'an, that you can hire other workers and assess the guy who quit and make him pay for the difference. Okay, in other words, if you have to pay more to get someone else to finish the job, you can hold the original employee liable to pay for any differential in the costs of hiring the second guy. That's what socher alehen means. But not to exceed the full amount that he would have been able to receive. O matan, or you can lie essentially to the employee and say you'll double or triple his salary if he stays on the job. You can lie, and then you only have to pay him what was originally contracted. Yeah.
Which is fascinating because you can hire somebody by no written contract, just by verbal saying I'm gonna hire.
Right.
So if you verbally tell them you're gonna double the deal,
Yeah.
that doesn't hold in this particular case.
It doesn't hold because
Witnesses?
because he reneged. He's acting unethically. Okay.
Sounds like two longs.
So
Make it right?
yeah, correct. So let's he's going to expand on this a little bit. Matil chiyuv mamoni al hapoalim ka'amor, that you can place some kind of financial obligation on the employees. Ach inyana shel hataya zu tzarech hesber. So the first one we can understand. The employee is on the hook financially when he quits in the middle of a job. However, the other one, as far as deception, that really requires clarification. Kach kosef harambam, keitzad matan. How do you deceive them? Omer lahem sela katzatzti lachem bo utlu shtayim ad sheyigmeru malachta. He says, I know I promised you 100, but come, take 200 in order to finish the job. V'lo yitein lahem elamasha pasak techila. And then at the end of the job, you only have to give them what you had promised them originally, which was the 100. And even if they said, show us the money, and they wouldn't continue working until you gave them 200, you can take them to Beis Din afterwards, and Beis Din will extract the extra 100. Okay? Al smach ma chozer bo ke'es mehit chayavuto nira sheniten lahasber zot b'shnei drachim. So by what right does a person have to withdraw his promise to them? Like, first of all, so he says, I would like to explain it in one of two ways. Ones mama, that a person was coerced to promise them higher wages because he was over a barrel. The only reason why the employer promised it is because he felt he had no other choice. He was coerced. And therefore it's not legally binding. The Omar le tul dinar v'havireni ein lo eles charo. That let's say a guy had just broken out of jail. Now we're talking about a frum yid who's an erlicha guy, and he's wearing the jail uniform. But what happened? He was unfairly imprisoned, right? Because he was a Jew. So he just broke out of jail. He hears the hound dogs barking, coming after him. And he says to a guy who's got a ferry that can cross the river, he says, take me across. He says, you jailbird, I'm not going to take you across. And he says, I'll give you $1,000, just do it. So and he takes him on and he crosses him and he says, okay, give me the $1,000. You only have to pay him the regular toll, what a ferryman would take for that. And why is that? He says the reason is because the guy feels that he's under pressure. He's not promising that money from a place of sound mind, or no, I think his mind is sound. It's just that he's under pressure.
Oh, economic duress.
Economic duress. There you go. That's exactly ones mamon. Economic duress. Yeah. Al hezber ze nitan lishol. Reishit v'chi ma pashutu l'shaker b'makom hefsid mamon. So v'chi ko pashutu l'shaker b'makom hefsid mamon. So the question you have to ask is it so simple that it's okay to lie when you're under economic duress? That's his question. So that's that's the first possibility. Sheni tarei klal biyadenu kemichira tachat ones tekifahi shekein agav zuzi gomaru makni. Sometimes people sell an item that they regret selling under economic duress. V'imkein gam kan kibel hamavid Timura lekaspo. And therefore, here too, the employer under economic duress is receiving a service in exchange for his money. V'yesh lechalek kisham kibel melo hatemura ach kan kibel pachot mima shehiskim ba'al karcho l'shalem. He says, in this situation, he's getting less than what he had promised to pay. Ach mahadin b'mikra shabo merosh. What's this word? Hozil oved scharo v'lacher mechem shehozilu v'chayich k'shadavar oved tovei shnei sloim shehu ha-mechir ha-mekubal shekein po mekabel ha-ma'avid melo ha-temura. He says, so the second question that we have to ask is it always okay for an employer to say, I'm only paying you what we originally contracted? It's one thing in a situation where he's offering a fair price for that kind of labor. Okay, let's say this job on the market should only cost $1,000. And he says, I'll pay you $1,000. And then the workers quit in the middle. The Mishnah says you can promise them 2,000 and then only pay them 1,000 later on. But what about a situation where the employer is a smooth negotiator, and he's able to negotiate them down to pay only $750 for $1,000 job, and then the employee says, I've decided it's not worth it for me to do this job for only $750. You want me to finish? It's going to cost you $1,000. So in that situation, what if he says, okay, I'll pay you the $1,000? Does he then have a legal right, according to this halacha, to say, I'm only paying you $750?
In secular, there are cases like this, and the way the courts look at them is that there's no fresh consideration for that deal. Because they both have already agreed to do the work for the original price. So to up it or down it, what's the new consideration for that, right?
Right.
The deal's no good.
Okay. But he's saying it's not as clear from the Gemara. It's not as clear as it would be when you promise them something that is far more than what the job is really worth. Shlishit, the third question we have to ask is, Ba'oto inyan shel borech mi beit ha'asurim hanal, nifsakim kvar shile menichem anu shemachal al onso v'gomaru makni. He says the third question we have to ask is that in the case of the jailbird who pays the ferryman far more than what the toll is worth, right? If he already paid him, the Gemara there says that we assume that he was moichel, and you can't take him to Beis Din to get the excess. Himkein minayin l'Rambam v'Shulchan Aruch shebenidon didan afilu shilem gova hatosefis chazara. Why then does the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch paskin that in our case of where I paid them more in order to finish the job, I'm allowed to sue them in Beis Din to get that surplus back? Okay, v'yesh lomar. So we might be able to suggest ki muter l'shaker l'misha osa imcha avla, that it is permitted to lie to someone who does something horrible. In other words, if kidei lahatzil me'ota avla, in order to be saved from that horrible fate that this guy is trying to impose on you. Bechinat im chasitit chasad v'im ikesh titapol. As it says in Shmuel Beis, it says with the saintly person, you have to be saintly. With the corrupt person, you're allowed to be perverse. In other words, if you are dealing with a person who you know is trying to damage you in some way, you are allowed to counter with your own kind of damage. And we find this with Yaakov Avinu, that he did this with Lavan. At least that's one way of understanding the story, that he knew that Lavan was going to try to rip him off and swindle him out of any kind of parting gifts. And so he used a method that either was miraculous or non-miraculous, I don't know, and he was able to proliferate a huge amount of livestock far more than Lavan had imagined, right? Yaakov took advantage of a situation that Lavan thought, he would be able to trick him, but that's the way the Meforshim understand that story. Because he's dealing with a swindler, I'm allowed to swindle him back.
Is that playing within the rules to your advantage? Like, I mean, if the rules of the contract are you've got to do a job this, not the rules of the contract, if the rules, if somebody says, I want a job done, or the way I'm going to pay you, in the case of Lavan was with the spotted sheep or not spotted sheep. So, okay, the rules are, I get the spotted sheep and you get the non-spotted sheep. So he had a method of maintaining that. It's playing within the rules of what the agreement was. So it's a different, I mean, to me.
Right, although some of the
it's not
Meforshim say,
swindling as such.
yeah, the way that the Meforshim speak it out is that Lavan had no idea that Yaakov would be able to do this. Had he known, he never would have agreed to the deal.
So if you employ a salesman, and you're going to say, I'm going to pay you a certain percentage on your sales, and that salesman of expanding your sales to a great extent, everybody wins. I mean, it's like so you're playing within the rules.
Yeah, but there are situations in business where you make a certain guarantee to an employee, not imagining that he's going to find some kind of way to use that contract to make a lot more money for himself. And you come back to him and you say, had I known that you were going to do it this way, I never would have contracted with you that way. So, I mean, you could find scenarios like that, I'm sure. But
I don't know how much redress would you have on something like that if it was taken to court? I mean, if the salesperson found a way to work a contract to better their advantage.
Yeah. I don't know, it's kind of contextual, right? Why, how?
Yeah.
But in any event, in this kind of situation, the reason we're saying that it's permitted to promise him extra wages and not pay him is because this guy was trying to cause you substantive damage. And that substantive damage, you're allowed to use whatever method possible in order to prevent yourself from being damaged from this guy.
But this could be like an incentive to the employees. Okay, if you finish your work on time, even though we have a contract or whatever, but if you need to give you a bonus. Because,
No, that's so that's different because you're making a new deal with them. You're saying basically, I know that you promised that you'd have the job done within a certain amount of time. I need it quicker. I'll pay you extra. That happens all the time. Yeah. So it's akin to where a person is allowed to create his own din to save someone from being oppressed. In other words, you're saving yourself, and sometimes you're allowed to create your own halacha in order to save yourself from being messed up by this guy. And so in a case where the employer was relying on the employee, you're allowed to deceive him to avoid financial loss. And therefore, even if I remember I needed a job done, a printing job done, when I was many, many years ago. And I went around and I didn't have a lot of money. And I was going around to different printers comparing prices. And this one printer quoted me a price that was much lower than the other people. So I decided to go with her. And then when I came to pick up, she said, I have to charge you more because otherwise I'm gonna be losing money. I said, but you quoted me a price. How can you?
So what'd you do?
I was an idiot. I paid her the money. Yeah.
It's
People tells yes
Yeah.
and don't pay. Okay, here.
well, they hold on to it to look at the money. The saying is the man.
I didn't want to make a Chilul Hashem, because she was a goy, but it's terrible when people do that because like you feel bad for them. You don't want, I didn't want to make her lose money, but
On the
I
same-
wouldn't have a problem.
You had to deal with it.
I know.
You made a deal, you made a deal. What's the matter?
It's like I'm teaching you life lessons. I mean,
What am I, a stalker?
yeah, I was much younger and naive and I had Rahmanas on her. Okay, anyway. But at any event, okay. לכן אפילו הוא זילו והתחילה מהמחיר מקובל, מכיוון שהמעביד סמך עליו, מילתו מחייבת. So therefore, he wants to argue that even in a situation where you were able to negotiate a lower price than the normal going price, once the employee commits to that, and then he wants to renege and jack up the price higher, he's not allowed to. And if he does, you're allowed to deceive him in that situation as well. Okay, we'll hold it here. And let me wish you a good Shabbos. I'll have a new sefer for us for Monday. And then we'll learn, I think, every day until we should be able to learn every day through Friday. Anyone else going away for Yantiv? Okay, you're all here. Enjoy.